We're taking to the smoky skies today as we're talking through every faction's aircraft in Warhammer 40K and which flyers give you the most bang for your buck. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where today we're focusing on everything aircraft and are pretty much going to touch briefly on every single flyer in the entire game of Warhammer 40k. First we'll just start with talking about flyers in 9th edition in general, and then we'll go through each faction in turn, talk about my favourite flyer or aircraft for that faction, then touch on all the other flyer choices and what I like or dislike about them. Now in general in 9th edition, flyers haven't been quite as dominant as they were in 8th. In 8th edition we had certain army builds that really spammed them heavily, things like the dreaded Eldar Air Force where everything was -2 to hit, and when Iron Hands flyers briefly became quite dominant as well, zooming around and hoovering basically everything off the board. Flyers did receive a few nerfs in the transition into 9th edition. They have very little interaction with primary objectives, they can't screen or move block quite as easily as they used to, they interact even more poorly than before with terrain, and of course the flyer wing was removed as well, meaning that it's hard just to spam an entire army of them. I wouldn't say the news is all bad though, as there are quite a lot of positives to having a flyer or two in your army. The main advantage is their ridiculously fast movement. Most planes will move in excess of 40 inches, and with the obscuring terrain rules and more terrain on the table, they can kind of be an alternative to Ignore's line of sight firepower, allowing you to physically move your plane to an angle where you can get shots on enemy units, ones that I'm sure your opponent would want to be keeping safe, hidden out of line of sight, maybe capping objectives. They can potentially be a good way of getting around lookout sir rules, just simply fly them fast enough so they can land by a character and hopefully shoot them if your opponent leaves them exposed, and they're usually going to get their damage output off first, deploying right at the very back of the deployment zone, hopefully outranging the opponent on turn 1 before swooping forward to do their damage. Aside from just killing things, flyers can be handy for a few other things. Although enemy units can move straight through their bases these days, it can still be pretty disruptive if you park a flyer right in the enemy's movement lanes. Enemy models can't actually finish a base on top of the flyer's base, so there's still the potential for holding up enemy units, meaning that they can't move quite as fast as before. A fair few have abilities to drop bombs in the movement phase, and that can be handy to deal damage in multiple phases for things like enemy Nightbringers, or against things that have a lot of protection against shooting attacks. And if you can manage to auto-explode a flyer in the enemy deployment zone, then that could lead to a fair few mortal wounds. They can cap a few objectives, such as engage on all fronts, where a flyer is a good way to get that on turn 1. And depending on the enemy army, they might be somewhat hard to deal with. They can't be charged under normal circumstances, so it maybe puts a bit more pressure on the opponent's shooting, particularly if you're moving up with a bunch of other threats. Finally, flyers do have a few more options with reserves than they previously did. If you pay CP to put them in strategic reserve, then it means they can essentially deep strike anywhere on the table, and if you are worried about a flyer getting shot off the board and you really want their alpha strike, that could be a way to achieve it, though of course you do have to pay in command points. At the start of 9th, Games Workshop did also make a big deal about being able to fly flyers off the board and then put them into strategic reserve and return in later turns. I think it's an okay option to have. It's certainly better than the flyer being automatically destroyed for flying off the board, but still typically it's going to be something that you want to avoid. It means that you're not going to be shooting for a turn, and that's going to be 1 out of 5 turns of the game where your flyer's doing literally nothing, and when they return later they risk it being a bit too late. It means that you do have to be quite careful with flyers with fixed movement arcs. They require just a little bit of forethought and planning where they're going to be ending up turn after turn, as if you point them in a certain direction, there's just going to be a large amount of the board that they might not be able to reach in the following turn if they desperately want to get some shots on the enemy. So anyway, that's flyers in general. Very fast, you typically pay a premium for the speed and manoeuvrability, and they're not always that hard to kill. Potentially a fairly niche tool for hammering the enemy where it really hurts, while the rest of your army goes around and does its thing. Let's go through the flyers for each faction then, and we'll start out with the Space Marines. So my favourite Space Marine flyers will be the Stormhawk Interceptor, followed closely by the Storm Talon gunship. I've gone with the Interceptor as my primary choice. It's 185 points for 10 wounds at toughness 7, working out to be 18 points per wound, meaning it isn't really particularly sturdy as flyers go, but it does pack a fairly decent amount of firepower, twin assault cannons, twin heavy bolters and a Skyhammer missile launcher, and if you're feeling a bit more spendy you can upgrade to a Las Talon or Cyclone missile launchers to threaten some heavies. Space Marine flyers don't seem to be seeing enormous amounts of play in tournaments these days, and I wouldn't say it's one of the most competitive Marine picks by any stretch of the imagination, but I think in certain lists they could do a fair amount of work, maybe in Iron Hands where you get a bit of extra durability, slower degrading, and also their helpful heavy weapons doctrine where you get to reroll hit rolls of 1 in the first turn. Could be good for jumping around the board, maybe clearing out some all-important enemy infantry holding objectives in the backfield. The Storm Talon's sort of another side of the same coin. It's cheaper and only toughness 6. You don't get quite as heavy a firepower as the Stormhawk, but you do pay less points for it, and it does have a helpful hover mode. Another fairly expendable unit to throw some firepower where it's most needed. Otherwise, for conventional flyers, we have the Storm Raven, which I still think is overpriced despite the points drop that it got in the recent chapter approved. For me, it's just at too much risk of just getting shot straight down without achieving what it wants to. I'm not the biggest fan of it as a transport either. If it's going to be transporting things, it wants to get up really close, and I just can't help but think it's just going to get shot straight down when it does so. We then have the Fire Raptor and the Storm Eagle, also fairly fragile for the points, but pack a fair bit more firepower than the Storm Raven. Out of the two, I prefer the Fire Raptor. I'd rather have the extra firepower and sacrifice transport capacity. Finally, there's the Xiphon Interceptor, a quite expensive flyer at 210 points. It is very long range with its anti-tank fire, could make itself quite hard to deal with, but does run the risk of being ignored as its firepower isn't crazy. We do also have a couple of Lord of War flyers for the Space Marines as well. The mighty Thunderhawk gunship is 800 points, toughness 8, 30 wounds with a 2+ armor save, and packs 4 twin heavy bolters, some Hellstrike missiles, a couple of blast cannons, and then its main armament either a turbo laser or a heavy cannon. Again, I'm still just not really sure it does enough firepower to justify its princely investment, but I'm sure to be very good fun to play with its enormous transport capacity, and being one of the few old marine vehicles that can transport Primaris. The Sukar Stormbird costs 1000 points, it's a lot harder to take out with 40 wounds, further reinforced with a couple of void shields on top of that. It has even more transport capacity, but it has even less firepower than the Thunderhawk, not packing a main weapon. Out of those two, I'd rather have the Thunderhawk. Finally, for the Space Marines, we have the unique marine flyers. Out of these 5, I feel that the Dark Angels flyers are the strongest, the Dark Talon and the Nephilim. They are a bit pricey at 210 points and 190 points respectively, and have 11 wounds at toughness 6, but they are at least fairly sturdy behind a 5+ invul save from their Jink, which they can make into a 4+ if you use the stratagem. The Dark Talon will hit you with 24 Hurricane Bolter shots, plus a fun Rift Cannon that gets D3 shots, and for every wound that you get through, you get 3 mortal wounds on the target, and a Stasis Bomb for a couple of mortal wounds, and then being able to make one unit not be able to fall back. Could be pretty devastating if they get tagged by the Deathwing. The Nephilim swaps those fancy tricks for just raw firepower. It essentially has 16 heavy bolter equivalent shots and a couple of missile launcher shots on top of it. Both of them seem really quite efficient for what they do to me, and having access to that 4+ invul save when they need it is no bad thing at all. The Corvus Blackstar for the Deathwatch I think is actually quite efficient, and it compares pretty favourably with the other Space Marine flyers in my opinion. It's 14 wounds at toughness 7, so 13 points per wound, a lot better than the standard pattern flyers. You get a twin assault cannon, 2 missile launchers, and if you want to soup up its firepower to the max, you can have Ignore's cover for 5 points with an Auspex array, and an extra Hurricane Bolter for a few more anti-infantry shots. Potentially you could use it to get some Deathwatch into the fray, though again I think it has the same problems as the Storm Raven for that role. You need to fly it right up to them, and then have it do nothing for a turn, and have its contents run the risk of being shot down. You can make it untargetable turn 1 for 2 command points, though that is quite a big investment, and the opponent might shoot something else. Finally, it does have a Blackstar Cluster Launcher for a little bit of extra damage over infantry, though it's only likely to chip a mortal wound or 2. Overall, I think that the Blackstar is quite an efficient flyer, maybe better than the standard Space Marine flyers to be honest, and perhaps the main reason that we don't see them at all is that it's locked to Deathwatch, which aren't really seeing play a lot at the moment, and it also doesn't particularly synergize with their infantry-focused playstyle all that well. Finally, for the Space Wars, we have the Stormfang and Stormwolf gunship, which I put in a similar boat to the poor Storm Raven. They've got some interesting guns, the Stormfang in particular can be fairly hard-hitting, but they're just still a bit overcosted and really fragile for the points cost. Again, with the transport rules as they are, I don't think they're a particularly great way of getting Space Wolves into battle. I think I'd just take more Marines on foot, Jump Pack or Thunderwolf. Moving on, we come to the Adeptus Custodes, who have a couple of enormous flyers in the Ares gunship and the Orion assault dropship. They're pretty sturdy. The Ares is 22 wounds at toughness 8, around about 20 points per wound, and it also comes with a 5+ invul. Not too bad at tanking for the points, particularly with that high toughness and -1 to hit. It puts out some pretty nice anti-tank shooting, averaging around about 17 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle, though it will be quite swingy on depending on whether or not you actually get those powerful shots through. You can still get rerolls with shield captains, as there's no such thing as core yet for Custodes, and it does have a quite powerful mortal wound attack, flying over enemy units and dropping some Infernus firebombs, Every unit within 6 inches had a half chance of taking D3 mortal wounds. Not too bad seeing as it can do that every turn. I feel like it's a lot of points to invest in a flyer where Custodes might just want more hard bodies on the ground, but I feel with this amount of damage and being fairly tough as well, it is likely to cause your opponent problems. In general, I prefer the Ares to the Orion Assault dropship. That's 500 points, so a bit more. The same defensive profile, and it trades its bombs for more anti-infantry focused firepower. It does however have quite a large transport capacity though, and I feel that these flyers might be a better way of delivering Custodes to the midfield, as they're going to be quite hard to take out because of how tough they are. Still though, I think I prefer the Ares. I'm not sure I'd really justify 500 points primarily to be a transport. Next up we come to the Imperial Guard, and my favourite flyer would be the sturdy Valkyrie. 120 points, and a really tough flyer as they go. 14 wounds at toughness 7, a pretty crazy 8.5 points per wound, the lowest flyer out of any of the ones that we'll talk about here. Of course the Valkyrie is mainly a flying transport as opposed to a damage dealer, so it's not really going to do much else aside from chipping away a bit against anti-infantry, though a multi-laser and some multiple rocket pods might surprise you for their damage. It's a lot better than most flying transports as it can deliver its cargo after moving via grav chute insertion, so it can be a way to deliver some melter squads or something to the front line and hit your opponent straight away from turn 1. After it's delivered its cargo, it can just be annoying to the enemy, jumping around hitting things that didn't want to be shot. Its roving gunship rule can give it a +1 to hit if it goes into hover mode, and if you're taking it with some Tempestus Scions, there are a few Scion related stratagems and options that can allow it to do a little bit more. Overall, it's a sturdy workhorse. As a flying transport I think it's truly excellent, and maybe if Guard's special weapon spam was just a little bit more efficient, it might be taken even more. Otherwise, Guard have quite a lot of other options in the Forge World range, though I have to say that most of them are fairly underwhelming for the damage that they do. I'm afraid I forgot to list their Lord of War choices here, the Marauder Bomber and Marauder Destroyer, both 20 wound flyers for over 300 points. They do have a couple of turns worth of area of effect bomb shooting, and then can chip away with a fair amount of anti-tank or anti-infantry fire. The Arvis Lighter's an interesting little flying transport, 85 points for toughness 6 and 8 wounds. No shooting at all to speak of there, so it literally is just a transport. The Avenger Strike Fighter might be one of my favourites out of the Forge World range. It's 14 wounds at toughness 6, and will at least stack a fair few hits on the enemy. It's going to average around 5 hits at strength 6 and AP -2, 2 damage, and it also packs a couple of las cannons and a heavy stubber. I don't think that the Thunderbolt is quite as good a deal, coming with just 8 autocannon shots and 2 anti-tank weapons. Not really all that good for 210 points, and neither is the Vendetta really. It's got a Valkyrie profile and 3 twin las cannons, though no roving gunship special rule, and it doesn't have grav chute insertion. The Voss pattern Lightning is 130 points and relatively tanky for the cost. It's really got almost no damage output to speak of though, literally just 2 anti-tank shots at ballistic skill 4+ aren't really going to achieve anything. And finally we have the Vulture gunship, which is either 180 points or 200 if you take the Gatling cannons, and it's kind of interesting as a flying mini Punisher that can swoop over to the other side of the board and stack 20 strength 5 hits on an enemy infantry unit. You really are paying for the mobility though. It's not going to be anywhere near as efficient as a tank commander with a Punisher cannon, and again it's very sad not to have the roving gunship special rule, which it did on its previous datasheet and could really help it become more efficient. Overall, out of these I do think that the Valkyrie is the best. A little bit of firepower, plus a reasonable way to pile out some heavy weapons or bullgrin right in the opponent's faces. Next we come to the Adeptus Mechanicus, and the technical terror that is the Archaeopter Fusilier. This was a beautifully disruptive little plane throughout 8th edition, and nothing appears to have changed too much in the new codex. If anything, it's got a little bit better. It's 10 wounds at toughness 7, so 13 points per wound isn't really all that bad, and it can be a little bit more durable. It'll get a turn of +1 to their save from Bulwark Doctrina, and potentially if you Mars, you could even stack that with the Shroud's Arm Canticle as well, maybe giving it a 1+ save on turn 1. The Archaeopters all have great movement with an extra pivot at some point during their move. This guy packs a little bit of anti-infantry with 4 Cognis heavy stubbers, so 16 strength 4 shots, but its main damage output comes from a mortal wound bomb. You do mortal wounds on a 4+, you get 1 dice per model, or 6 dice per vehicle. It usually means that this guy should be doing around at least 3 mortal wounds per turn, which isn't too bad on top of its anti-infantry fire and its good movement. It then also has a trio of really good stratagems, its command uplink to turn off aura abilities, seismic bomb to slow down a unit that it's moved over, and one of my personal favourites, the auto-explode one. That can be really nice if your opponent is clustered all around the plane, and potentially deal out even more mortal wounds than it ever would have done in life. For an extra 20 points you can give it chaff launchers for -1 damage, not really mandatory but not the worst option either, and there is quite a helpful custom Forge world if you are running things vehicle heavy, where you can get a 6+ feel no pain and reroll all hits with Cognis weapons. That could very reliably be stacking 16 anti-infantry shots on the enemy wherever they are. The Fusilade really is a very efficient choice for the Adeptus Mechanicus right now. Otherwise though, I still think that the Stratoraptor is fairly solid. It costs a bit more at 150, and it trades out those bombs for 2 Cognis las cannons with a D3+3 damage and a couple of phosphor blasters. Again, could be very good with that custom Forge world. Rerolling the hit rolls on those las cannons is efficient, and it could be a good tool for reaching out and putting some pinpoint firepower down behind enemy lines. Finally, we have the Transvector, the transport vehicle. It's still very much hampered by its transport capacity of 6 and little damage output aside from that. It does have a new interesting drop pod style deployment if you take 2 of them and start them off the board, but realistically I don't think that spending 220 points for that manoeuvre is really going to be worth it. The bombers would certainly be my first go-to when building an Admech list. Next up, we're leaving the Imperium behind and talking Chaos Marines, where my favourite flyer is the Helldrake. Helldrakes are 150 points for toughness 7 with 12 wounds, 12.5 points per wound, and that's not bad with 5+ invul and wound regen on top of that. They're really quite sturdy as they go. The Helldrake's damage output is really quite mediocre. Its Baleflamer and claws might punch an infantry or 2 to death, but compared with other demon engines it's not really going to do all that much. However, I think that the real value of the Helldrakes is that it's not an aircraft and it can charge after moving. A massive 30-inch movement means it can jump straight into the enemy deployment zone turn 1 and then charge whatever enemy unit really doesn't want to be locked up by a big flying monstrosity. You can't move over it in the same way as aircraft, so it's good for move blocking as well, and it potentially can be a good one for delivering certain stratagems such as the Night Lord's Vox Scream, or that one that makes everything within a terrain -1 to hit. If it needs a little bit more damage, you can think about using 1 command point for Demon Forge, if it has managed to get good movement and engage something that's absolutely critical to the enemy battle plans. Certainly not particularly good for damage dealing, but can be a very disruptive tool to get in the way of the enemy's plans. From Forge World we have the Hellblade and Helltalon. The Hellblade's 135 points, a very light flyer with 9 wounds, toughness 6 and a 5+ invul. Not all that much damage dealing though with its las cannons and autocannons. The Helltalon's 210, that'll be 14 wounds at toughness 7. It packs a couple of area of effect bombs where you get mortal wounds around a point and then can chip away with a few las cannons and high strength shots. Both are kind of okay for the points, though nothing enormously scary. Then, similar to the Space Marines, we have the Fire Raptor, Storm Eagle and Xiphon Interceptor. In particular, the Fire Raptor might be interesting as a target for the Chaos Prayers. Warp Sight Plea plus some rerolls from a Chaos Lord could allow for some efficient firepower to get going, as you can be unleashing quite a lot of heavy bolter fire with them. As with Space Marines, Chaos can also take the Thunderhawk and the Sokar. The Thousand Suns also have access to the full complement of flyers, and the Death Guard have everything aside from the Helldrake, though unfortunately you can't use them to spread contagions of Nurgle anymore. They FAQ'd it to stop something like a cheap Hellblade being able to jump forward and stop contagions of Nurgle spreading via the Flash Outbreak rule. Overall, I wouldn't say the Chaos Flyers are particularly top choices for them, though maybe a fast and annoying Helldrake or 2 could be annoying alongside some other tough demon engines. Moving on to Xenos now, and we start out with the Craftworlds, where my favourite of their current flyers are the Crimson Hunter, maybe considering upgrading to the Exarch if you want to. The Eldar flyers are all very expensive indeed, the standard Crimson Hunter being 180 points, with the Exarch going up to 210 at max. They're around 15 to 17 points per wound, and toughness 6 with 12 wounds. Crimson Hunters and Exarchs can put out some pretty reliable firepower with the Expert Crafters and Masterful Shots combination, and similarly to the Admech, they're very manoeuvrable indeed, being able to pivot again after they've moved, so they're unlikely to have to fly off the board. They're never really going to threaten infantry all that much, they only get a small amount of high quality shots with bright lances, pulse lasers and star cannons, and if you pay the extra 20 or 30 points to upgrade to the Exarch, that will give them reroll 1s to hit, and the option to either trade that out or spend 1 command point to take a 5+ invul save as well. Could be quite good for keeping the expensive plane alive. The Hemlock Wraith Fighter is another interesting pick. It does bring a lot of utility to the table, but it's also painfully expensive at 240 points. You get to fire with a couple of D-Scythes with D3 auto hits each, fairly reliable for doing at least some damage to the target. It's got a -2 leadership debuff, which can be a bit more relevant in 9th, particularly now Space Marines can sometimes fail morale checks, and you also get quite a nice Warlock-style psychic power or smite, potentially hitting the enemy with something nice like Jinx or buffing your own units. Certainly has the potential to be useful, but I'm just not sure it's really worth it at 240 points. Finally from Forge World there's the Nightwing for 220 points, 14 wounds at toughness 6 with a 5+ invul, though for the cost the damage output is very low indeed. A couple of shuriken cannons and bright lances just don't really cut it at 220. The Drukhari flyers are really quite similar. The main difference for me is whether or not you'd want to upgrade to the Void Mine that the Void Raven bomber brings. Void Ravens are 12 wounds at toughness 6 with a 4+ save and a 5+ invul, and cost around 185 to 200 points depending on whether or not you upgrade to the missiles. The Void Lances can give you a little bit of powerful anti-tank, strength 9 lance shots with D3+3 damage, and you can take the missiles on top of that for a bit more firepower. The main reason that you take the Void Raven is the incredibly scary Void Mine, where you nominate a point on the battlefield that you've moved over, you roll a dice for every enemy unit within 6 inches, and on a 4+ they take a massive D6 mortal wounds. It might make your opponent second guess their own deployment, and if they do have an army that's quite elite and wants to castle, then this could be seriously punishing them on turn 1. Depends a bit on the army, but if you roll well for this, you could be taking out a sizable chunk of the opponent's forces very early in the game. The Raven Wing's cheaper, but does only 10 wounds. It trades out its Void Lances for Dark Lances, gets some missiles included at stock, and also has a twin splinter rifle. This one's more about just applying firepower exactly where it's needed, if you just want a bit of shooting and don't want to shell out for the Void Mine. Out of the two, I slightly prefer the Void Raven bomber. I feel like it's quite a nice disruptive option to have, and maybe just does something a bit different compared with the Razor Wing, where I feel that if you're taking that, you might be more tempted to take things like Ravagers instead. Next we have the Necrons, where we have the Doom and Night Scythe, both of which in the new codex aren't enormously outstanding for the points, though if I had to pick one to be the best in the faction, I would probably go for the Doom Scythe. This Croissant of Death is a 200 points 12 wound toughness 6 critter, and like all Necron vehicles, it has its living metal regeneration. The Death Ray is some fairly hefty anti-tank, 3 shots at strength 12, AP -4 and D3+3 damage, which is quite nice on a flyer that can jump over to the back of the board and maybe shoot things out of line of sight. The Tesla Destructors aren't too bad either, should net you on average 10 strength 7 hits on enemy infantry. They perhaps have a bit more value in Mefrit, where they can get some AP -1. Doom Scythes aren't really the toughest to take down though, and I think that they struggle somewhat to compete with the other Necron anti-tank ranged units. In general, I think that Doomstalkers, Doomsday Arcs, and now even Locust Heavy Destroyers might be the preferable option if you do want to shoot down some tanks. If you're willing to pay the premium for the mobility though, it's not really the worst option in the world. The Night Scythe for 145 points is the Necron Flying Transport, the same defensive profile and Tesla Destructor minus the Death Ray, and a big 20 model transport capacity, where if you want to transport for anything that isn't Necron warriors, then this really is your go-to. I'd say perhaps the best use of the Night Scythe is the 1 command point Prismatic Dimensional Breach stratagem. This allows you to set up a unit out of strategic reserve after movement. They can set up anywhere within 3 inches of the Night Scythe, and can be really close to enemy models, kind of netting you an auto charge out of reserve. My main issues with it are that it's a bit command point intensive, and you have to have a turn of the Night Scythe flying around doing nothing anyway, and if the opponent chooses to focus it down, then the unit's just going to be coming on from strategic reserve at the edges of the board anyway. In general, for strong Necron units in transport, I think that a Ghost Arc filled with Gauss Reaper warriors does just fine. Finally, there's the Forge World Night Shroud Bomber for 190 points. It has a once per game bomb that I don't think is really worth the additional investment. I don't think it's really worth 45 points more than the Night Scythe, and then after you've dropped that, done a few mortal wounds, you're essentially just a flying Night Scythe that's likely to be ignored. Not really the best for Necron flyers to be honest, despite the new codex. It's been a while since 5th edition when Night Scythe spam could just hoover enemies off the table. Next up we come to the Orks, and my favourite flyer for the faction is unsurprisingly the Burner Bomber. 12 wounds at toughness 6 with a 4+ save means it isn't the sturdiest flyer in the world. It's more like 17 points per wound, not 13, sorry. However, provided it can avoid being shot down turn 1, that doesn't really matter, as usually the main reason for Burner Bombers to be around is the fly and headbutt stratagem. Literally just fly your Ork plane right up to the enemy lines, fly it straight into the ground, the plane dies, and everything within 6 inches takes a massive 3 mortal wounds. Ideally it would need to get a fair few enemy units in range to really be worth it like this, but if you can get this in position against an elite army, it could deal a devastating blow right from turn 1. If it doesn't make sense to blow it up though, you've got a few shooter shots coming out of it, it can potentially take Scorcher rockets, though usually I think I wouldn't, and it can actually do a fair amount of mortal wound damage to enemy infantry by using its burner bombs. If you've got large units of enemy infantry exposed, it could hopefully scythe down a fair few of them, and then you can use the wildfire stratagem to potentially affect a unit right next to the unit that you've hit. Otherwise, we have the Dagger Jet between 150 and 170 points, which I think is quite expensive for its toughness profile that it shares with the burner bomber. It has between 12 and 18 shots at strength 6, AP-1 and damage 1, all at ballistic skill 4+ if you focus on the same targets. Not particularly outstanding damage output to be honest, but if it has no real targets, you could potentially use Flying Headbutt if it makes sense, so you only get the D3 mortal wounds rather than flat 3. Next there's the Warspawn Blaster Jet for 160 points. It's armed with a fair amount of high strength, high damage shooting, including a pretty nice smasher gun. It's fairly interesting in that it can take a custom force field for a bit of extra durability, and its shooting can be kind of good in death skulls where you get to reroll one hit, wound and damage results. I think it's possibly my second favourite after the burner bomber. Finally we come to the Blitzer bomber, whose bombs are maybe a little bit more general purpose than the burner bomber's ones. It can target things other than infantry, though I still think it's directly eclipsed by the burner. Its bombs are still very good, and having the big 3 mortal wound Flying Headbutt option just makes it far higher value. Next up we have the Tau, who as well as their standard flyers have quite a few Forge World options. I would actually say that their Forge World Remora stealth drones are maybe their strongest flyer right now. A very unusual unit with 1 to 4 flyer models that work as a squadron, a 30-inch unrestricted movement with no need to pivot, and each one's at least fairly hard to take out with toughness 5, 5 wounds, a 2+ save with their light cover, and -1 to hit. If you need them to deep strike, they can innately deep strike, pack a little bit of strength 5 shooting with 8 strength 5 shots per model, and have a couple of low strength seeker missiles that you could maybe focus down with a marker light. They could be quite good models for jumping around into table quarters, securing engage on all fronts, and maybe move blocking enemy units or shooting things that shouldn't normally get line of sight to them. I feel the Codex flyers are a bit undergunned. The Razor Wing is fairly tough, 12 wounds for 118 points, but I think that's mainly because it's got very little firepower to speak of, and I think it's a flyer that most of the time the opponent's just going to be able to comfortably ignore. The Sunshark might do a little bit more with its pulse bomb attack, dealing out some mortal wounds, and it has some interceptor drones that could be an interesting option to detach when it's in the enemy deployment zone and maybe make a nuisance of themselves. The Tiger Shark, Barracuda, and the 2 patterns of Tiger Shark feel quite similar, at least relatively sturdy models in themselves with a good number of wounds and a 5+ invul, and the options of either big burst cannons, railguns or ion cannons depending on which one you prefer. I guess good to have for the manoeuvrability, though I don't think they're particularly strong for the cost. As with a fair few Tau units, their ballistic skill 4+ lets them down. Out of those, my favourite might be the Tiger Shark with the twin ion cannons. It seems a bit more efficient for the cost. Finally we come to the enormous Manta, 2000 points and one of the biggest models in 40k, toughness 8 with 60 wounds and a 4+ invul, and a casual 200 model infantry transport capacity, and can carry 4 tanks. That's basically an entire army list in one model. It does have quite a ton of guns, 48 burst cannon shots, 6 ion cannons and 2 heavy rail cannons, though again all hitting on ballistic skill 4+. Definitely out of the remit of any normal size 40k games, but a hilariously impractical 40k model that I'm quite glad exists. Finally we come to the Tyranids, and again as with a fair few Nid things, I feel like the Forge World choice does eclipse the main Codex option, with the enormous Harridan swooping in at 700 points. This thing was spotted winning a GT for Nids in the fairly recent past, one of the only big tournament results that Nids have got so far, so I think it seems reasonable to include it as the top choice. It's toughness 8, 34 wounds and can get a 5+ invul for 1 command point. It hits with a pretty impressive 16 strength 10, AP-3 and damage 3 shots, all at a ballistic skill of 3+, and +1 to wounds if it's willing to sacrifice a few wounds on itself. It can get damage 4 with its pathogenic slime stratagem if it needs to, and it can also engage in melee with 5 damage 6 attacks in the fight phase. Most of the time flyers of this size just don't really tend to work because you're concentrating too much resources in one enormous model, but the Harridan is genuinely very hard to take out, and seems to have enough damage to punish all the enemy heavy hitters, while hopefully allowing the rest of the Nid list to go around and do its thing. From the main codex we have Hive Groans and Harpies, both of which, like the Chaos Helldrake, are non-aircraft flyers. They have toughness 6, 12 wounds and a 4+ armor save, maybe fairly mediocre shooting, but can do some disruptive charges and tie up enemy units. Out of the two, I prefer the Harpy to the Hive Crone. It has slightly heavier firepower, and a Spore Mine bomb ability, where either you get a mortal wound or 2, or get to deploy an annoying move blocking Spore Mine. I think that both of these might have a little bit more utility if Nids weren't already quite so good at getting first turn charges. If you can double move a unit with the Swarm Lord to get some actual heavy hitters into the combat zone turn 1, there's maybe just a little bit less value in engaging with one of these that aren't going to do all that much in melee. So that just about brings us to the end of the video. And to sum up, I'd say that these are maybe some of my top picks for the best flyers in 40k right now. Perhaps my single favourite for the utility that it brings is the Archaeopter Fusilier. This thing just wins on pretty much every level, a fair amount of OK anti-infantry shooting, reasonably durable, one of the best bombing rules in the game, and an enormous amount of disruptive stratagems and good buffs that really synergize with the rest of the Admech codex. The Raven Wing flyers are very nice as well, having a 4+ invul and a reasonable amount of shooting. The Guard Valkyrie is very tough, and maybe its biggest weakness is that it lacks amazing contents to deliver up close, and it's also competing with the very efficient Chimera. Finally, the Ork Burner Bomber is a very scary threat to have in an Ork list, and could either terrify the opponent into deploying very weirdly, or just fly in and rip the heart out of an enemy army if they don't deploy well. So anyway, let me know what you think of 40k flyers, and if there's anything for your faction that you think I've overvalued or undervalued when making this video. If you've enjoyed the vid, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly try and keep these videos coming, with new 40k stuff coming out pretty much every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the content a lot, I would just like to mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description below. Making all the content does take a fair amount of time, and if you are enjoying regularly, then any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages as well, seeing certain new videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next for the channel, and automatic entry to the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.